Thank you for joining me tonight. I'm excited to talk with you about woodpeckers as a new, relatively newer birder. I really enjoy woodpeckers because they are here year round. They like to make themselves known, and they're just beautiful. So I'm excited to share some facts with you about these wonderful critters tonight. So as usual, I'm going to stop here and talk about our mission, but I want you to pay attention to that QR code there in the bottom. If you don't already get our newsletter the first Thursday of every month, make sure you scan that or just go to our website and it should be the first thing that pops up for you. That's where you're going to get all of the timely information. Again, it comes out the first Thursday of every month and it has stuff about what's happening in the park along with our education programs and some of our community partners as well. While you're doing that, I'm going to talk a little bit about our mission. So the mission is to conserve Portage County's natural heritage and provide opportunities for its appreciation and enjoyment. And that's what Jen and Becca and I love to do. We want to take people out, see all of the opportunities that Portage County offers us, and then share things like about the woodpeckers so that you can appreciate it and enjoy your time outside even more. Okay, let's jump right into it. So I'm going to start with probably my favorite topic in biology, and that's adaptations. Because if you look at all the organisms in our world, they've all been specially adapted to live and survive in their environment. And they have all these telltale signs that tell you what they do and what they're good at doing. So there's a couple, more than a couple actually, that we can talk about with woodpeckers. First and foremost, let's talk about that pointed beak. They're called woodpeckers for a reason, right? And sometimes they're even called chiseled beaks. And if you look there, it's really nice and long beak because when they are pecking on that wood, they need the proper tool in order to get inside. But you might think, if you're banging on wood all the time, then doesn't that cause damage? And yeah, it does. But luckily, even though a majority of their beak is made of bone, the outside of it is covered in keratin, much like our hair and fingernails. So while they're chipping away, if a crack or a break happens, just like in our fingernails, they can regrow it so that it doesn't cause a damage that's caused by when they're drumming. Right? The next one is going to be these bracing feathers, and I want you to look at this photo here very carefully. So we see this beautiful northern flicker, and if you go down, do you see how its tail feathers are kind of pushing up against the tree that it's on? That's because it has these specially evolved feathers called bracing feathers. So while they're banging away, if you hit your head, it's going to naturally reverberate backwards. But instead of flying all the way backwards, those tail feathers push up against the tree and keep it stabilized. So that's the position it's going to be in while it's drumming or pecking, and it's going to keep it right up against the tree and not flying all over the place. I think my favorite one are their specialized toes, right? So when we talk about the songbirds a lot here in our webinars or out in the parks, because those are our perching birds and a lot of our songbirds. And they typically have 3 toes in the front and 1 in the back, and that makes them really good at perching and holding on to things. But if we look here, this family, or this group of birds belongs to the picaforms. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, but their feet are designed so that there's 2 in the front and 2 in the back, and that makes it really good for clasping onto that wood. It's kind of hard to see in this picture. You can definitely see the 2 on top and that 1 to the left on the bottom, but to the right, there's also another one on the bottom. It's kind of like a grappling hook. It just hangs onto that wood, whether they're walking up and down the tree or pecking away. So their feet, those zygodactyl toes, as they're known, is what really helps them hold on. So this is a really funny picture, but it gives you an idea of just how long the birds' tongues are. So woodpecker tongues, if you think about what they eat, right, usually they're trying to get to insects underneath the bark, and they don't have fingers to go in and pluck them out. So once you navigate a hole in the wood, they have to be able to go in and get the insects out. And what better way than to have a really long, sticky tongue? And that's what they do. Some of the birds even have tongues that can extend 4 to 5 inches past their beak. Right? Um, this picture gets even funnier, right? And this is probably one of my favorite things when talking about woodpeckers, is the fact that they have this canal within their head space that allows their tongue to retract and act as kind of an extra helmet or cushion for when they're pecking away, right? So their tongue, which is really long, can go out and get those bugs, but when they're not and they're just pecking, that tongue can kind of curl up and around and act like a helmet from all that reverberation that's happening within their skull, and it just helps them. So that's why we don't see any woodpeckers with concussions, right? To go along with that, they also have a specialized skull. So where the beak meets the head, there's a little piece of cartilage that's going to allow and help with shock absorption. Um, so the shock absorption from that cartilage, along with the tongue wrapping around, really acts as good protection for their brain, so they're not getting rattled around all the time. And then uh, this picture, well, let me go back one. If you look here, we're going down to eye protection now. You see how the rest of this bird is really smooth and sleek, but right around its beak, between its beak and its eyes, it gets a little fluffy. So it has these feathers over their nostrils that are going to help protect, because when you're chipping away at wood, you're going to have shrapnel, for lack of a better word, right? All of those wood chips, um, the dust that's coming off, right? You need to protect your eyes. And they don't make little birdie goggles, so they have to have these adaptations in order to help them. So the feathers are there, but then to go back to this creepy picture, this is obviously not a woodpecker, but it gives you a good image of what's going on here. So just like you and I blink up and down, the birds do too, but it's not really helpful when you're making a lot of noise to have your eyes closed in case you do draw in a predator, right? If you draw in a competitor, you want to keep your eyes open for those things. So birds, much like alligators and other reptiles and sharks, have these things called nictitating membranes. So not only do they blink up and down like you and I, they also have a third eyelid that's going to cover it. So while their two main eyelids are open, they can have this third nictitating membrane across their eye, and it still gives them some visibility, but it acts as an extra layer of protection against the wood that's flying off and potentially into their eyes. So again, they have all of these wonderful adaptations. I'm sure there are more, but these are the biggest ones that we're going to take notice of when we're out in the parks. Okay, so I want to do a little practice run. If you remember the last time we did a birding webinar, I couldn't share my sound, but I think Mr. Google has come through for me. Maybe you can confirm. There we go. So hopefully you're hearing that on your sound. If not, let me know. But we're going to be able to hear the birds as we go through them. So they make a drumming sound to announce their territory and attract mates. So we know when we hear woodpeckers pecking away, yes, they're looking for food, but also they make drumming sounds for different reasons. So they could be announcing their territory, they could be attracting a mate, and they use it to communicate with members of their own species. Drumming is a little bit more intentional than just the pecking that you might hear when they're looking for birds. Okay, so the sound you just heard is this one right here. I'll pause and play it, and then we'll talk about it. Hit it one more time. Okay, the thing you just heard is the red-headed woodpecker, and we usually don't go into scientific names a lot, but I think this one is kind of a dead giveaway, right? A lot of times scientific names are, they're not really helpful if you try to break the word down, but here it is. So when we think about melanin, the thing that gives our skin pigment, right? Or it means darkness, so they have that melano here, right? Erythro means red, okay? So think about your red blood cells. Their scientific name is a erythrocyte, a red blood cell. And then we know cephalus has to do with heads. So if you break it down, it's a dark redhead. And that is aptly named. Oh my goodness, this one just wants to keep calling. So with the red-headed woodpecker, you can see that their entire head is enveloped in red. And we'll kind of compare that with the bird you see next, okay? They do prefer open woodlots, and they love oaks because they love acorns, right? Here, the birds are not sexually dimorphic. So what that means is that the males and the females look the same. Okay. In a lot of different organisms, we can see that the male and the female have different colorations, especially in birds, but these do not fit into that category. They really liked eating insects and fruit and seeds, but also they're really good at catching insects out of the air. Okay. So I want you to look at this one, the red-headed woodpecker, and now pay attention to this next one. So here we have the red-bellied woodpecker, and you might be saying, hey, that one has a red head too. So when you're out in the field, it can be hard. You really have to think about what you're doing. So remember the red-headed woodpecker, its head is fully red, the whole thing, right? Where here, the red-bellied woodpecker just has this cool mohawk going on. But where it gets its name, if you look at its belly, see this little tuft of red feathers right here? So that's why it's called the red-bellied woodpecker. It's not really helpful because most of the time you're seeing the bird like the picture on the right. The belly is up against the tree, so that's not helpful. But just so you know that that's where that name is coming from. So again, let's pause and listen. Okay. So this is one of the most common woodpeckers we're going to find in Ohio. If you go out birding, you're going to hear this one. Okay, it likes to call, likes to float around, so it's probably one of the ones that you're going to be able to notice more often. They do prefer forests, but they can be found other places, and their coloration is a little different than the last one as well. So the red-headed woodpecker, some people compare it to like a flying checkerboard because it has thick bands of red and white. This one, I've heard people say it's more like a tweed jacket because it has this more elaborate black and white striping, sorry. They are omnivores, right? So that means they eat both animal and plant products. So they eat insects and nuts and seeds, but they've also been known to eat tree frogs, eggs, and then even sometimes fish. Okay, I think this one has to be one of my favorites, right? It's so adorable. So here we have the downy woodpecker, and this is our most common woodpecker in Ohio and also the smallest. So let's listen to this sound. Okay, so these are found all over the place, right? If you're gonna go birding, you're gonna hear these. Another thing to know is that not only do they like the forest, but they also come out. If you've ever gone on a hike with Becca, Jen, or myself in the fall, we're gonna talk about goldenrods. It's just a fact of life. We love them. And a lot of times you'll catch us talking about goldenrod gulls. So if you look at the gulls, which are the little balls that form on the stem of the goldenrod, if you find a little hole in it, that's usually indicative that the this woodpecker, has come down to try to get the insect that's growing inside of that gall. So it might be hard to catch one on the goldenrod, but you can definitely look for signs that a downy woodpecker has been there if you find a gall on the stem of a goldenrod and there's a little hole in it. Okay. These birds are sexually dimorphic, and you can tell because the males have a red patch on the back of their head, like you see in this picture. So we know because of that red patch that this one is a male. And there's some stripes, right? If you look from the top of their head down, you see black, white, black, white. They have some striping there, but this kind of mottled or whitish feathering on their belly as well. And they like insects, berries, and seeds. All right. So you might be looking at this picture and saying, Holly, we just looked at that bird, and I can totally understand why, because there are very subtle differences between the downy woodpecker and the hairy woodpecker. And we'll go over those in a second. But um, for the most part, we think about where they are, right? These birds, the hairy woodpeckers, really like older, kind of undisturbed woodlots. So the big old trees, they don't really come out as much as the downy woodpeckers do. And these are insect eaters. But the same thing applies. You can also tell that this is a male because of that spot on the top of their head. So let's listen to him, and then we'll go and compare the downy and the hairy woodpecker. Okay, let's compare them. So here we have the hairy on the left and the downy on the right, and you're right, they look very, very similar, but there's just a couple things I want you to point out, or I want to point out to you, rather. So let's look at the beak first. If you look on the left, that hairy woodpecker, it has a relatively long beak, and you can compare its beak to almost being as wide as its cranium, right? So it has a very long beak compared to its head size. If you look at the downy on the right, the beak is very short, okay? So for me, when I was learning, that's the first thing I learned. If it has a short beak compared to its head size, I know that it's a downy woodpecker. Another thing, when you get really good, is to look at the tail spots, right? So if you see on the hairy on the left, its white lateral tail feathers, or the tail feathers on the side, are pure white. Whereas if you look at the downy, you see how his tail feathers have these black polka spots on them, right? So that's another way, if you want to get into the nitty-gritty, to tell the difference between the two. Another thing you can talk about is the size, okay? Harry's are about the size of a robin. I know this picture doesn't really indicate that. Again, these aren't to scale, but the hairy, the one on the left, is going to be about the size of a robin, whereas a downy is going to be smaller and about the size of a house sparrow. And if all that fails, just know that downies outnumber hairies 10 to 1, okay? So if you see a bird and it looks like this, there's a good chance that it's a downy and not a hairy. Emma Kennedy also shared the way that she remembers the difference between the two. And her way to remember it is downy means dinky and hairy equals huge, right? So downies are small birds with small beaks, and hairies are huge birds with bigger beaks. So that's another way to remember it. So thank you, Emma, for sharing that. Okay, let's go with the northern flicker. I'm gonna play the call, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so you might have recognized that kind of maniacal laughing, right? Maybe you didn't know it was a woodpecker, but there's a good chance you've heard it before. And let's just take a moment to appreciate how beautiful this bird is, right? So if you look at those spots, some of these feathers have just a single polka dot on them, right? And of course, it's little blush that's here on its cheek, and then that black necklace around there. So they're just stunning birds. Okay? Give me a second. I'm gonna close my door. I don't know what my dog's upset about. Okay, sorry about that. Maybe they saw a northern flicker. Who knows? Okay, so these, obviously they're woodpeckers. They're going to be in the trees and in the woods, but you can sometimes find them just as easily on the ground because they love ants, and they're going to excavate for those ants. I know the first time I ever saw a northern flicker, it was on the ground, and they were doing kind of this courtship mating dance, and they were just in the middle of the grass, and it was beautiful. Uh, Typically with our woodpeckers, they're not migratory birds, right? But the northern flicker is actually a highly migratory bird. So even though you'll see them here all year long, you're going to notice them in more numbers near migration times, right? So in the spring and the fall, you might notice a bigger number for them. Um, on this bird specifically, right? If it were to fly and pick up these wings, you'd see these beautiful yellow flowers underneath there. So we call it a northern flicker. You might have heard it in the past as like a yellow shafted flicker. Okay, but for all intents and purposes, northern flicker works just fine. Okay. Um, The other thing I wanted to add to them is that they're different from other woodpeckers because um, they don't tap on the trees for food. They only do it to excavate a nest. Remember, they like to eat the ants and the insects that are on the ground. So when they're tapping, they're making their nests. Okay. Let's go on to this one, which is usually a fan favorite. You could say pileated or pileated. I've heard it both ways. I'm going to say pileated. Sorry if that's wrong for you. To me, it's potato, potato, right? We all know that we're talking about this big bird with the red head. Let's give him a listen. Okay. So those sounds are pretty obvious, right? They're going to make themselves known. In fact, we were doing the Christmas bird count at the end of last year. We're in the middle of the back of Shaw Woods, right, which is a good forest, and it was relatively quiet. And then we heard that noise, that kind of squawking, maniacal laughter, approaching, and it did it the whole time. It just flew over us and made that noise the entire time. So they're not afraid to let you know where they are. That word, whether you say pileated or pileated, means crested, and they do have that red crest there, right? The beautiful top of their head there. For them, these are the largest one, and they're closer to crows, right? Um, like I said, their calls are pretty obvious. And when you go to Towner's Woods, I feel like at least 5 hikes I did last summer at Towner's Woods, you get just off the parking lot onto the trail, and there's a pileated woodpecker sitting on a dead log on the ground, just drumming away. All right. So hopefully you get to experience that this year, but pay attention when you're at Towner's Woods because there's a lot of trees down around there and they like to excavate them and they're huge, so they're really hard to miss. Okay. Oh, I didn't want it to play again. I just wanted to show you this picture. So I don't have a lot of tips on how to point out woodpecker holes, right? But these are obvious because they're such big birds. They make these kind of interesting, either square or oval shaped holes in the tree. So if you see a hole like this, you know it's been excavated by a pileated woodpecker. Okay? And they love the insects that they're getting out of there, but one of their favorites is carpenter ants, actually. And if you've been around for a while or into pop culture, you probably recognize this guy, right? So there's Woody Woodpecker, who had that fun laugh. He was a cartoon. I think he was started in 1940s, maybe. But he was obviously based off of this character here. You can see that red crest right on him. So there's a little blast from the past. All right, this last one is not one of our nesting birds in Ohio. It does just migrate through, but you might come across him if you're birding in the spring or the fall. So this is a yellow-bellied sapsucker, aptly named because his belly is yellow, and guess what he eats? Sap, right? To me, they're funny-looking woodpeckers because, yes, they have the bill of a woodpecker and the general coloration, but they just look like a chubby little regular songbird. I'm sure that if we could get a different angle, you'd be able to see his feet in here, right? But to me, that just looks like a regular bird pretending to be a woodpecker. So again, these are only found in Ohio during migration, and they drink the sap from the trees. All right. So I kind of generalize this to cover all of the woodpeckers we've just talked about. So for the most part, they're going to be mating and nesting in May and April. And then the female will lay about 2 to 6 eggs in a cavity. You might notice that their eggs, just like owls, are a little bit rounder because if you're in a comfy cavity, they're not going to roll away, right? And then, like we said, when they're drumming on a tree, they're looking for food, getting a nest, or attracting mates, or communicating in some way. So that's how they're getting their nest. They're going to open it up and build their nest right down inside of that tree. Okay. So I did want to talk about the status of them for a minute because a lot of times when we talk about nature these days, it can get a little sad, right? There's been a decrease in numbers for a majority of the populations we've been talking about, but with woodpeckers, for the most part, it's not that bad. So I did want to share a little bit of good news with you. Um, so, all of our woodpeckers are protected under the Federal Migratory Bird Treaty Act that was enacted in 1918. So they've been protected, right? That's not to say that they don't still need our help, because obviously, if we get rid of forests, then that's going to hurt the birds. It's not necessarily directly hunting them, but we need to protect the land that they live in, right? So they do still need our help in order to stay in the status of least concerned. I did want to point out, however, that the red-headed woodpecker is near threatened, and that's because one, loss of habitat that we just talked about, but also it's experiencing some nesting competition with those starlings that we know are invasive, right? And what are the benefits of woodpeckers? So, of course, they're beautiful to look at and they make birding a treat, right? But they have other benefits as well. Of course, they're eating insects, right? So that helps with pest control. And then when they're making their cavities, yes, they're living at them and raising their young and looking for food, but when they leave those cavities, they've made a home for other organisms who want to live in a cavity that don't have that strong chiseled beak to kind of break it out themselves. So things like chickadees, our wrens, our flying squirrels are all going to find an old woodpecker hole and live in it, right? So it's really helping to create habitat for our other insects. And if you want to see woodpeckers in your yard, of course, it helps to have trees, but they really like suet. I think they're funny. Remember those zygodactyl toes? They'll even hang upside down on suet feeders in order to get to the food that's in there. And they love peanut butter as well. So whatever you got to do to attract them, because you don't want to miss these birds that we have. If you want to keep seeing them and learn how to identify them in the field, I want to invite you to Birding Club. This is going to be our first in-person birding club of the year. It is Saturday, February 17th. It's going to be at 8 a.m. at Shaw Woods. Okay? I know it's early, but it's worth it. We're going to see a woodpecker. I can almost guarantee it. Okay. That's also the same weekend, I think the 16th through the 19th, for the Great Backyard Bird Count. So if you're into citizen science and you have the Merlin Bird app, make sure you get on there and look at the birds in your own yard and add that data, because it's a good citizen science project and helps us know where these organisms are. Okay, I'd be happy to stay around and answer any questions that you have, but hopefully I see you at future programming and definitely at Birding Club. Thank you so much.